Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. I'm Bob Allison, President of the Colonial Society, and I am delighted to welcome you and our speaker this afternoon, Adrian Chastain Weimer, who is a professor of history at Providence College. She began her formal education at Wake Forest University, earning a degree in English and in religion. And then she moved on to the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where she studied church history, getting her M.A. summa cum laude, and then on to Harvard University, where she earned her doctorate in American religious history. And her first book, Martyr's Mirror, looked at the persecution of Quakers and others in early New England. And she is currently working on two projects. One is a history of Deer Island during King Philip's War, and the other is actually a project she is co-editing for the Colonial Society on the papers of Daniel Guggen. And she's here to talk to us this afternoon about her recent book, Constitutional Culture, New England and the Struggle Against Arbitrary Rule at the Restoration Empire. A terrific book. I would tell you more about it, but that's what she is here to do. So please welcome Adrian Weimer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bob and Anne, and all the people who keep this organization going. It's a thrill to be here. I'm especially honored that David Hall is here, who's, I can't even describe my debt to him as a historian and a friend. So I'm delighted to share some of my research with you. I'm going to start. This will go. Oh, I might need some help. No, we did test this earlier. Yeah, perfect. Okay. I'm going to start with Thomas Hutchinson, who I know is dear to many at the Colonial Society with the beautiful new volumes. I first read this section of Thomas Hutchinson's 1764 History of Massachusetts Bay. And as I scanned the lines, I thought he was making things up. Actually, I thought he was confusing the 18th century with the 17th century. He claims to have original manuscripts on his desk from persons of influence in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that forward a political theory about the nature of civil subjection. In this sophisticated, forward-thinking theory, there's two kinds of subjection, necessary and voluntary. The first, necessary, arises from actual residence, not from birth. If you live somewhere, you have to obey that region's king or governor. If you move away, your necessary subjection ceases, and you can enter into a new kind of voluntary subjection based on compact or charter and ultimately on consent. Now, as you probably would, I spent an inordinate amount of time searching EBO, the early English books online, and early American imprints for these phrases, trying to figure out where they came from, right? What was he reading? Where was this theory circulating? What was going on? All I came up with was some Irish Catholic political writings that weren't a great fit, and then, of course, later thinkers like John Locke. I left the research trail convinced there must have been some kind of confusion in the masses of papers on Thomas Hutchinson's desk. Fast forward a year. I was sitting in the reading room at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I happened to be going through the papers of some 19th century town historians and antiquarians. And I know that's an odd thing to do for me, but I was actually finding more and more that these antiquarians gathered 17th century manuscripts, and sometimes they just ended up in their papers, or they died, and they were working on a particular set of manuscripts, and so those 17th century manuscripts ended up in those collections. And I came across this political treatise. It's in the form of a letter. It's unsigned. And to my astonishment, I realized it used almost all of Hutchinson's phrases: necessary subjection, voluntary subjection, compact. The treatise author, as I realized, of course, I raced over to the other side of the reading room and grabbed Thomas Hutchinson's history off the shelf, and I started comparing the language and thinking about them side by side. And I realized that the author of this treatise was working in an opposite direction. He's trying to undermine that theory of compact. He's trying to undermine whoever those manuscript authors that Hutchinson was talking about were. But the bigger point is that all of the pieces fit together for a full-fledged, high-octane debate in Boston right around 1666 over the nature of subjecthood, the nature of consent, and the nature of empire. So this is how now I see the debate playing out. It all happens in the wake of 4 royal commissioners' 1664-1665 visit. As you all know, the royal commissioners had first conquered Dutch New Netherland. They had turned it into New York. Then they had toured New England, trying to pressure the colonies, especially Massachusetts Bay, into rewriting law codes and redesigning their civic and ecclesiastical institutions. Most of the people in the Bay defied the royal commissioners, and much of my book, A Constitutional Culture, is about how people from across the social spectrum mobilized to defy these royal agents. And it's important to note that the larger picture for that visit across the empire is that Charles II, the restored monarch, is starting to experiment with ways to siphon power from the localities to the crown, not just colonies to the crown, but also regions of England, the London Corporation, borough governments. He's trying to siphon power to the crown. He's also experimenting with different revenue streams, not least through his newly chartered Royal African Company. Previous scholars, not all, but many, have seen Charles II's government as weak, disorganized, and without a clear plan. But his brother, the Duke of York, was the one who planned the Royal Commission in 1664 and 1665, the one that tours New England. And they are well organized, well funded, and they have a clear plan for bringing the region into line with royal priorities. After the colonists rally to defy the royal commissioners, there's a strange calm that hushes Boston. Everyone's waiting to see what's going to happen. One of the royal commissioners, Samuel Maverick, claimed the only way to make Bostonians obedient subjects is to send a permanent armed frigate into Boston Harbor. We'll hear that again. Cooler heads prevail in London, and in the end, the king demands this: the king demands that Governor Richard Bellingham and other named men come to London in person so he can hold them accountable for the colony's defiance. You can imagine there's a serious discussion in the Massachusetts General Court about the king's demand. We have a partial account of what they said. Much of the debate is legal over the limits of royal prerogative and whether the king has a legal right to claim Governor Bellingham's presence. They're meeting in Boston, but I put this map here because, as Mark Peterson argues, and I think is right, there's Boston as the city-state, and then there's the hinterland. So this doesn't just affect Boston. This affects all of New England, these debates about royal prerogative and constitutionalism. And, I wonder how Bellingham, as you see on the right here, is feeling in the midst of these debates. This is not abstract for him, right? He's the one who's going to have to board a ship to London if they decide to send him to acquiesce to the king's demand. And I always think about Bellingham in this moment. I mean, he's in the room. He's in the midst of these debates. He's quiet, actually, during these debates. And I wonder if he was thinking back to the first charter crisis of the 1630s. Of course, he's an original patentee, so he had been there. He had read the Quo Warranto when the king tries to take the colony in 1636. His name was on that Quo Warranto. Bellingham's not a guy to be pushed around. In previous years, as you probably know, he had often taken the side of the people, or at least the deputies, against more elitist visions of government in the Bay. Just the prior year in 1664 and 65, when the royal commissioners had been in his face in Boston, pressuring him to take an oath of allegiance, which was a kind of unconditional oath. There's this moment where Richard Nichols, who's the leader of the 1664 Royal Commission, he gets right into Bellingham's face And he says this, he says, I hope the governor will show that fair example to begin at first. Like, you need to step up here, Governor Bellingham. I'm sure His Majesty expects it from him. Love and favor are conditional on duty and obedience. The king will not suffer himself to be deluded. The language goes on, and it's a veiled threat to call him up for treason. Bellingham, along with the other magistrates, of course, takes the oath with an addendum which says the same is to be understood not infringing the liberties of the patent. So he takes it, but with this very important, in fact, essential tag on. So, you know, I always wonder how Bellingham, having lived through those experiences, having been a part of building this colony for so long and having faced Richard Nichols, I always wonder how he's feeling about the prospect of being sent to London and whether his fellow leaders are going to make that decision. This part is relatively well known, but it's the essential background for the debate, and it'll lay the groundwork that we need to understand the new material in the 1666 treatise and in Hutchinson. So this is the debate as most of you know it. You know, it's about legal issues. It's about royal prerogative. It's about whether the king has a legal right to demand anyone's personal presence in London. And underneath all this is the issue of appeals, right? Judicial issues. Who has a right to appeal? Where can those appeals happen? Under which law code do those appeals work? So, you know, there's certain people among the magistrates, including Daniel Denison, who are going to say what is a truism of English politics in the 17th century, that prerogative, royal prerogative, is as necessary as law and is for the good of the whole, right? So if you are a subject, that implies the duty of obedience. So the king can call you to London. There are others who are going to draw back to the English Civil Wars, and I'm so convinced in the midst of this debate that people were actually reading pamphlets. We have at Mass Historical, at American Antiquarian Society, at John Carter Brown, we have Civil War era political pamphlets that are owned by people who were circulating in these debates. So it's quite clear that, you know, some of these folks are reading those pamphlets. William Hathorne, in particular, is going to say prerogative is not above law, but limited by it. Strong constitutional statement. And then Francis Willoughby, in somewhat dramatic terms, pleas to his fellow leaders, how easily may the king in 1 year undo all that God hath done. So there's a political legal debate that's happening in the general court in this moment. There's also a theological debate, and the ministers are present in their role as advisors. Of course, they have no real authority. And some of the ministers actually do say that Bellingham should go and obey for conscience sake, that your Christian duty is to obey your king. Others, in particular Jonathan Mitchell, the Cambridge pastor, counters that the civil magistrate is the minister of God for the good of the people. It's a version of Salus Populi. So far as his commands tended to their good, they ought to obey. None would say it was for the good of the colony to send away their rulers. So, based on the good of the people and the role of the magistrate, which is, of course, a vocation that's separate from the ministerial or church vocation, but nonetheless is a vocation ordained by God, that they should not, in fact, as a Christian duty, send away their governor. Okay, so all this is in the Danforth Papers. But now, with Thomas Hutchinson's summary, combined with the 1606 manuscript treatise, we can see that the debate continues after this on a much higher intellectual constitutional plane. It's clear that the authors of the 1666 Royalist treatise are pressuring the Bay leaders to retract, to apologize, to obey unconditionally Charles II's demands, including sending Governor Bellingham to London. These royalists are drawing on the French political theorist Jean Baudin to argue for a high, near-absolutist version of royal authority. And what that does is it aggravates, it provokes the other colonists, many of whom are present for this debate, to articulate their understandings of voluntary compact and consent. The debate as it takes place in the treaties, and I'm sure in back rooms and walks around Boston, it points to some roads that John Locke took and some he did not take in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina and the Second Treaties of Government. Probably more importantly, it gives us a way to see continuities between the Puritan constitutionalism of the Civil Wars in the 1640s, the Puritan resistance across the Atlantic in the early Restoration of the 1660s, and what we now, following Mark Goldie, can call the Puritan Whig movement of the 1680s, leading to the glorious or Williamite Revolution. So the colonial royalists, the one who write the royalist treatise, understand what the Bay leaders are up to, right? They understand their claims for charter-based liberty to write their own laws and run their own churches. But they also have a plan for justifying the royal commissioners' claims to full military, criminal, and civil powers. They do this by evoking Baudin's distinction between the power of government, which rests with the Massachusetts General Court, and the sovereign authority, which is held by the king. And as far as I can detail their arguments, this is what these royalists are saying. The king has absolute authority. It's absolute not meaning above the law, but rather only God can hold kings accountable. No human being can hold the king accountable for transgressions. They put this in the 1666 treatise like this: royal rights cannot be yielded up nor detracted nor any other ways alienated by any tract of time prescribed against. You cannot detract from royal rights. Distance doesn't matter, compact doesn't matter, you cannot detract. No matter how far away the colonies are, or how much time they've been running their own governments, the crown is still sovereign, and only the king can call people to account. Nobody, no human, can call the king to account. Only kings or their representatives, they go on to say, can interpret the charter or reform governmental structures. And this is the clicker. They can only, the kings are able to punish colonial leaders who cross the line. In fact, if the general court makes any decision that they see as seditious, then the common assembly of all the people, all the freemen, can be punished. Right? So not only can the leaders of the colony be punished for decisions that they see as seditious, but in fact, by extension, all the people in the colony who voted for the deputies and the magistrates could be, by extension, punished. Okay, these royalists adopt this theory of sovereignty, but also Baudin's rejection of the right of resistance. In simple terms, they say, against a king, there is no rising up. Give examples in this treatise of the Bohemians and the Huguenots. Resisting rulers, they say, just like those groups did, will only lead to bloodshed and destruction. And I'm not going to go into this second part of the treatise, but the interesting thing about it is that they start cherry-picking lines from John Calvin, the French reformer, and John Owen, the English Puritan leader, in order to make their point against a right of resistance. It's really pretty impressive. They've done their homework. They know their audience. And so they're pulling these sort of out-of-context lines from Calvin and Owen to say there is no right of resistance. If John Calvin and John Owen were in the room, I'm not sure they'd agree. Okay, so this is the 1666 Royalist treatise. You can imagine how many people in the colonies took this very seriously. There's biblical arguments, there's arguments that are deeply rooted in a certain aspect of, a venerated constitutional tradition. But many colonists, especially the leaders, just aren't so sure. They are operating according to a different model, perhaps a pre-Hobbesian model, in which the jurisdiction of the king over distant commonwealths is not yet so clear. And they're wrestling with this. They're wrestling with the geographical implications of sovereignty and all these different constitutional issues. And so this is when they make the move. This is when they delve into the nature of civil subjection itself. Going beyond practical arguments, they do give a bunch of practical arguments about it. Just takes a really long time to dialogue with the king about all these constitutional issues. You've got to wait 6 weeks or more for the ship to come back and forth to receive answers. So they give some of those kind of arguments, but then they head in this more theoretical direction. They say that subjects in faraway places have a different relationship to the English government than people in England. There's necessary subjection, and there is voluntary subjection. Necessary derives from actual residence within any government, not from birth, and it incurs an obligation to submit to the laws and authority of that place. But any subject has a right to remove, as long as you don't weaken the state, and especially you have a right to remove if you've been deprived of something like liberty of conscience. If one of your basic rights has been compromised, then you have a right to leave. On this removal, when you leave, necessary subjection ceases, and you then can, you don't have to, but you can enter into a new kind of subjection, a voluntary one. So they're very open in this response, which I'm piecing together from multiple sources. Having been freed by geographic removal from natural subjection, Bay colonists have entered into this new voluntary subjection through the Royal Charter, which they call a mutual compact, from whence arises a new kind of subjection to which they're held and from which they'll never depart. Strong language. Only the charter, they say, determines the nature of subjection. And I'll just note, this is an early version of written constitutionalism. Colonists at such a far distance are exempt, they say, even from the king's demand for their presence. They say there can be no lawful summons to call them to answer in England. And so this has immediate, and you can draw the lines. You can see how this king's demand for Bellingham's presence is then answered by these high-level theoretical constitutional arguments. As scholars on the British side have remarked, this kind of language is virtually unsayable during the Restoration in England. New England is one of the last places in the English Atlantic where resistance theory of this kind, or this kind of open constitutional limits on royal authority, is still being discussed. I'm pretty sure the debate went back and forth because you can see them responding to each other's arguments. The royalist-leaning colonists see the duties of subjects as the same, they say, whether they're natural subjects by descent or necessary subjects by force of arms and constraint, they have this third category, or voluntary subjects by consent or agreement. They don't care. No distinction. They don't acknowledge the legitimacy of the distinction. They say it all comes to one pass. The king has a right of jurisdiction from the first through John Cabot's 1497 discovery, a right of which the king did never divest himself, and therefore this right of empire, they call it, continues as firm and inviolable after the granting of the patent or charter as ever it did before. So this idea that faraway colonists could refuse the king's right to demand governors is simply ludicrous. For the most part, this is an intellectual, real ideas kind of debate, but here they go down a bit and they just start mocking the other side. They say it would puzzle all the logicians, lawyers, and divines in Europe to find under what tropic to place such kind of subjects as will allow none to have jurisdiction under them. Right. The two sides also debate at length on the reach of Parliament's laws, a topic on which even the royalists disagree. I'm not going to go into those debates, but there's really interesting debate that takes place in this treatise and the other documents about the reach of parliamentary legislation. There's much more to say here. There's actually also a debate about native sovereignty in these documents, which I'm happy to talk about later. It's a fascinating set of ideas. The royalists, in the end, know conclusively that neither the charter nor geography lessens Charles II's sovereignty, which is absolute. I'm comfortable saying this is a remarkable moment in Atlantic constitutionalism. We want to be careful here. Colonists are not venturing into some kind of republicanism unless it's a monarchical kind that wants to prune or distance but still honor royal prerogatives. Bay colonists plead over and over again they want to obey the king. But, they say, self-preservation does enforce us to choose otherwise. So, in the end, as you know, they refuse to send Governor Bellingham and the other named men to London, and they send a shipload of valuable masts instead, those long white pine ship masts. As if the substitution wasn't clear enough, one cheeky ship's captain christens one of the masts Bellingham, just in case it wasn't clear. these high-level political theories dovetail with grassroots action. I'm not arguing that every colonist had a sophisticated understanding of Baudin or French political theory or Civil War era pamphlets on constitutionalism. I'm not making that case. But I do think that a remarkable number of people understood that kings, or in our world, modern presidents, can't retract liberties on a whim. The constitutional culture that informs this intense moment of pressure from the Stuart regime involves sets of ideas which are widespread. I'm happy to talk more about any of these, but I wanted to at least mention a few of them that we find on the ground in this moment of intense constitutional formation. The first is ideas about metropolitan ambition. And the idea that ordinary people actually have an obligation. Wherever there's a concentration of power, ordinary people should keep an eye on it. It's astonishing how they remind each other that there's an ambition in the metropole, which happens to be where much of the power is. And at various points, this will get turned on Boston, right? You can't control where this goes. But there's a wariness of metropolitan ambition, which implies an obligation for ordinary people to keep an eye on power and what people in power are doing. There's also defensiveness about civil and religious liberties. And, it's John Davenport down in New Haven who articulates some of these ideas most clearly, and also in his correspondence with Leverett. But there's all different kinds of ways that this language shows up. That what it means to be defensive about your civil and religious liberties, to watch them closely, is also that you can define what those liberties are and where they come from. There's a basic literacy about constitutionalism, what I think is prevalent in this culture and is becoming more prevalent through this moment of crisis. There's also circulating theories of consent, and this is an area where there's just a great deal more work to be done. There's so much more work to be done on the nature of consent, how it happens, the nature of consensus, how it works in this culture, right? What does it mean? Who's involved? What kind of practices lead to a general understanding and agreement about consent? There's also, as we've seen, an elevation of the charter, both as a kind of written constitution, or at least in the nascent form, they're heading in that direction. And there's much more to say about that. And then the last one is one I've been thinking quite a bit about, but this is a capacity for risk. And there's some terrific scholarship on the European Reformation, which is tracking this question as well. Is what is it? How does it affect a people? How are certain political theological ideas circulating among people who are more likely to give their livelihoods, their lives, to pledge all kinds of support for civil or religious liberty? Where does that come from? What kinds of ideas, what kinds of assumptions are present in a people who has a certain kind of capacity for risk? This is very much related to the fast day sermons, so I read through as many I could find of the fast day sermons from the 1660s, which give all this incredible information about the kinds of constitutional political ideas that people were actually thinking about at the time, not just the ministers, but as a part of a broader conversation that happens both in congregations and outside them. So the fast days have a lot to say about capacity for risk, right? What is an appropriate capacity for risk? How much should you risk personally for the common good, for the good of the colony, for the good of your government, for the good of your church? Other practices of grassroots mobilizing at this time include debates, not just high-level debates at the general court, but also debates that are happening in the street. And we see these in lots of different places, but we have accounts of people wrestling with these questions. They wrestle at them at fast days, they wrestle with them at town meetings, they wrestle with them at dinner parties, they wrestle with them in walks around Boston. So lots of different conversations happening on the ground about these larger constitutional issues. Also issues of intelligence gathering, and this is where the letters back and forth from London are just astonishing, right? The kind of what's actually going on in the Privy Council, what's going on in the streets of London, how can we figure out an accurate version of what's happening, how can we make sure that our friends in London, those people who are lobbying for us, can have an accurate version of what's going on here. I want to just make a plug for committee work, which all of us, I'm sure, are involved in. So thankful for the committees who keep the Colonial Society going decade after decade. I think this is one of the unsung features of constitutionalism in the 17th century, is these committees. And we have their notes, right? We know what was going on with these committees, who arranged for the Mass to be sent. We know who paid for the Mass. We know who did the fundraising, who enabled the Mass to go. And there's just a phenomenal wealth of information about these committees and how they made the plans and remade them, and sometimes Plan C and Plan D and Plan E, right, when things didn't work out the way they thought the first time. But all these committees who are figuring out how to act on the consensus of their leaders and of the general people. And I was hoping I might have 5 extra minutes, which I do, to talk about the petition campaigns, because this is one of the most fascinating aspects of this grassroots constitutionalism of the 1660s. It's so tempting to think that these constitutional ideas are simply happening on the level of the elites and the general court and the people who wrote the Royalist Treatise and the people who respond to it. But what we now know from finding all these town petitions in the 1660s is that, there's an extraordinary number of people who are involved in these debates. And these are signatures. I think these are on the Roxbury petition. Here you can see, of course, some of them are signing with a mark. But we think we have a quarter of the freemen of Boston who actually signed petitions in 1664, 1665, advising their leaders about how much they should compromise with the king, right? Who should be involved on very particular issues, not just compromise or don't compromise, but on this issue, you can give a little. On this issue, you should stay very, very firm and not hand the king what he wants. And so I'm just going to show you really quickly some of these petitions and what they look like. All these different people, we know a lot more now on the English side about what goes on and who's involved in these kind of petition campaigns. And, certainly there's some influence from elites, but I'm convinced after having read these and the process by which they're compiled and how they gather signatures in the woods and in people's living rooms, the real breadth of participation that's represented in these, what I'm calling the resistance petitions of 1664 and 1665. There are some wealthy merchants who favor compromise with the royal commissioners, and they do have petitions as well. So there's petitions on both sides of the issue, on compromise side and on the defiance side. But the petitions from the wealthy merchants, mostly in 1661 and 1666, they actually are moderate. They don't go nearly as far as that 1666 Royalist treatise, and they certainly aren't backing a version of absolutism. They're basically saying if we make some small compromises now, it's going to be better for us in the long run. I also want to highlight the non-freeman petitions. We have petitions in 64 and 65 from non-freemen in Boston and Northampton and elsewhere who basically say, we understand there's people, especially people who are royalist leaning, who are some of these wealthy merchants, who wanted to recruit us into a royalist party. And of course, we know Samuel Maverick, with money from the crown, is going around trying to raise up a royalist party as he tours Massachusetts in 1665. And these non-freemen say, we're going to say to you very clearly why we don't think that's us, why we didn't want to join a royalist contingent, why we actually stand with the leaders of the colony, our elected leaders of the colony. And they're pretty honest in these petitions. They say, there's things about the colony we would like to fix. There's laws that we think are not fair. There are ways that we would like to correct course in this government. But in the end, we have a better life here than we would have in England. We appreciate the freedom of the churches from the state. We appreciate the liberties we have. Some of these people, of course, would have hoped to become freemen in time, so some of them are younger and would have hoped to join the church and become freemen over time. But they're very clear that all these rumors in London, all these rumors and assumptions that Samuel Maverick's making as he's trying to raise a royalist party are actually misrepresenting them. Right? They decide that they, along with many of the freemen, want to stand with the elected leadership. They value the right to elect their own leaders, to write their own laws, and they are not willing, for the most part, to compromise with the king. even Thomas Hutchinson, in the early 1760s, admits, as you see here, that the government of the colony will not be thought culpable for refusing entirely to submit to the absolute authority of the commissioners. He's speaking about this 1660s moment. He says, that authority, which must have superseded their charter, and if this authority had been once admitted, they would have found it very difficult ever after to have ejected. So even Thomas Hutchinson, in this early moment, sees the actions of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, both freemen and non-freemen, also women, some of whom signed the petitions, and involved politically in other ways. Even Thomas Hutchinson sees this grassroots mobilizing in defiance of the royal commissioners, that they may have had a point. Even he admits that. I wish we could find the manuscripts that Thomas Hutchinson had on his desk. I think sadly they're lost. Yet we know enough now to say that these strange colonists were reading political theory from the civil wars of the 1640s. They're building on it. They're contributing to the ideas that fueled the revolution of 1688 and 89. And this is how I conclude. New England is by no means the center of vast early America, as we're now calling it, nor does it need to be. But these odd people made significant contributions to the history of English political thought, and they nurtured a broad-scale, grassroots constitutionalism. Thank you.
It's a question that's hanging over the project of where the local people became so persuaded of their own initiatives and authority. So the petitions are from towns, and town meetings are much more open to, it's not a freeman, non-freeman
Right.
situation.
Right.
Is that itself important, do you think, in this larger story?
It is. It is. I think very much so, because, we have plenty of evidence that non-freemen spoke up in town meetings. I mean, really the only limit in a town meeting that I can show if you can't, the only limit on speech is really if you're obnoxious, if you're just rude, then they'll fine you. But other than that, I mean, in terms of the range of speech that's allowed at these town meetings, I think it's pretty extensive. And I certainly think that kind of political practice of being in these meetings and hearing debates, I think is a form of initiation into this political mode. Sure.
So at one point, like in the 19th century, we romanticized the town meeting, and then it got kind of pushed aside. But it
Right.
sounds as though your work can make us once again strongly conscious of its political workings, its importance in the overall shaping of a political, or sustaining of a political culture.
Sure, yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, even things like, people at the town meetings have to volunteer to draw the bounds. They have to volunteer to do the work of keeping a town going. And I think there's a kind of ethic of public service that's nurtured in that place. I mean, I'm not saying these places were perfect by any means, but I do think there's a lot of volunteering that goes on at the level of the town meeting where people have to step up and do the work.
Excuse me, John, I want to give you the microphone.
Be loud.
Be loud.
How much of an Anglican presence was there in the colony in 1666? And the religious liberty argument could cut both ways. I mean, there are Quakers and there are Baptists who think that their religious liberty might be suppressed by
Right.
the general court.
Right. There's not a whole lot of, there's a couple of Anglicans, a couple dozen families probably up in Maine, and one of the chapters of the book is about that, about those families, especially up in York. And, they're not as predictable as you might think. There's actually an Anglican priest, Robert Jordan, up there, who does get involved with these debates, and he's some of the most vitriolic curses of John Cotton you've ever heard come from this Anglican priest. So I think it's the previous scholarship sometimes on the royal commissioners reading their works at face value and not looking at the really detailed revision of the law code that they try to implement tries to make them proponents of a kind of generalized religious liberty. I actually think that's pretty mistaken, because if you look both at what they do in Maine, which is try to impose a version of Anglicanism on everybody, and also if you look at their revisions of the law code, they're just as interested in suppressing Quakers. I mean, they're friends with some Quakers. Elizabeth Hooton is in the mix in all this. She sets herself up as an ally of the Royal Commissioners, kind of an unofficial spy. So Quakers are involved in all this, and they're trying to claim a kind of, we're with the king. But in fact, the Royal Commissioners and their revision of the law code, they want freedom for Anglicans. They're not interested in real freedom of religion for anybody else, which is pretty consistent with Charles II's with what's happening in a lot of other places. Yeah. Kyle.
Well, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Adrian. I wonder if you might just reflect a little on the forgetting that we see in this story. Is it surprising to you that it sounds like the way you set up Hutchinson telling this, that this incident is forgotten even a century afterwards? Is there a longer tale to it? Because in some ways it is a kind of usable past for the 1760s as well.
It's a terrific question. So what I was surprised to find is that there's a significant number of sermons and pamphlets from the 1660s that recirculate in the 1720s at the moment of that constitutional crisis, and then that circulate again around the time of the Stamp Act. So I think this was better known. And the irony of all this is that, of course, Thomas Hutchinson is the one who makes these documents available. He's a really interesting constitutional thinker in his own right. So as we've been so fortunate to know now. So I think these stories were much better known in the 1760s than they have been, in the past century, for sure.
I was wondering if it's possible to statistically enumerate the number of signees to petitions and the number of petitions. You use the words rally and mobilize, and this is very surprising to me. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you can supply numbers.
Sure. So, some scholars in the 1980s did this work, and also more recently, Jenny Pulsifer has done this work, so I'm pulling on their numbers. And the estimate that we have is at least a fourth of the freemen signed town petitions. So I'm putting together an exhibit for the Commonwealth Museum. It's going to be online, where we actually have the full text of all the petitions that are extant, along with some information about them and some curricular exercises and that kind of thing. So this isn't live yet, but it will be soon. So we can go back and the language of the petitions is really amazing, and we know the signers. So I've tried my very, very best to transcribe the signatures, so we know who signed, and so there's a lot more work to be done on those demographics, who was involved. But I think it's safe to say it was more than we thought, right? Of the kind of people who were involved in the political process.
Presumably some may have been lost.
Oh, quite a few were lost, and some of them we know about. Yeah, so Reading, for example, was lost. Chelmsford was lost. Yeah, and I'm actually hoping that when we put this up live, maybe in someone's grandma's attic, they'll emerge.
Can you say a little bit about the native sovereignty that you
Sure.
mentioned earlier?
Sure. Well, this is a debate that happens at this moment. It also happens again in the 1680s when John Higginson is arguing, the pastor of Salem is arguing with Andros, the governor of the Dominion of New England. So, one of the interesting things is that as the debates about native sovereignty that pop up in these 1665, 1666 documents, they actually lay the groundwork for an ongoing conversation. So this is a kind of snapshot of a moment. But all this is self-interested, right? But the colonists are saying the king is not the ultimate landlord of New England. He doesn't have just a blanket right to the land or to dominion over the land based on John Cabot's discovery. So they value the charter. They certainly think that that gives them a certain kind of legitimacy back in England. It certainly means the Spanish or the French can't claim the same territory. But in fact, they say here, and Daniel Gookin, who we're working on, says in other places, and then John Higginson is going to stay in the 1680s, that our right to the land is based on purchase from sovereign native princes. And I know that opens up a huge, huge debate about, whether they're sincere in that language. But they do make a pretty strong statement at this moment that the right to the land comes not primarily or exclusively from the king, but from purchase.
You mentioned at the beginning that the royalist argument essentially says that the king has exclusive ability to interpret the charter, and also everyone can be punished, right, if it's violated. Does this remain theoretical, or is there any execution of that theory in London on the colonists?
Yeah, I mean, it's an open question, and this is work I haven't done, but to what extent the way that all these events are playing out on the Bay, and then, the royal commissioner who actually brings the news back to London, he gets captured by Dutch pirates on the way back, and he doesn't have his paperwork, and, of course, people in New England are saying, oh boy, he got gagged just like he tried to gag us, it's this whole set of language. But basically, he finally does orally tell people in London what's going on. And so I think one of the open questions, which is outside the scope of my project, is how that affects Charles II's dealings with nonconformists in England, right? Who he sees, of course, as very close. I mean, these are all part of one group. And so, how the penal legislation, what we sometimes call the Clarendon Code, is going to get revitalized in the later 1660s, and how the king is making these decisions, how the Privy Council is making these decisions. So there's no immediate retaliation on the Bay. They're able to keep their charter, run their colony for another 20 years. I mean, you could call Andros the delayed retaliation. That there's an argument for that, or Randolph, who's, the tax collector who comes in. But I think if there is an immediate retaliation, it's on London corporation Puritans. It's on the folks he can get at in his immediate neighborhood. There's a lot more to say about that, and I think this is where one of the things we're really trying to do, many of us in the field, is bring these parts of scholarship together. The people who are working on London, the peripheries, and nonconformity, and the political and religious history of Restoration England, and telling these stories in a more unified way.
Following up on that, does anybody talk about effective sovereignty? Effective sovereignty versus necessary sovereignty?
Oh, I haven't.
It's a long way away from England to
Yeah.
Massachusetts, and how much control could the king really exercise?
Right. Yeah, I mean, he was pretty good about getting those royal warships over there when he went to conquer New Netherland, and he certainly has money that he's willing to throw behind this, in part because he's interested in mines, he's interested in ore, he's interested in trees, in the forest. So there's economic reasons to be interested in this. It's interesting. I see that on the side of the General Court, where they make very practical arguments, especially about appeals. And the judicial process, that it's just not feasible. It's not realistic for somebody to have to go to London, or a royal judge to come to the colonies every time somebody doesn't like a verdict at the level of the General Court. So I don't see it. I don't know. It'd be really interesting, actually, to go deep into those Privy Council Lords of Trade files and see what they're admitting about effective sovereignty. I haven't done all that work. Gabriel Glickman's new book, Making the Imperial Nation, does a little bit of it. He goes deeper into those files than anybody has yet, and so he has some interesting things to say about that too. Yeah, thank you.
So we have a question from one of our live stream viewers, George Goldberg, who spoke here last year on his book Easy Money.
Great.
And he asks, the commissioners noted in their final report that local minting, a most symbolic issue, was treasonous. Is there evidence of debates or petitions about this while they were there?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those places where they just make, I don't know that they have any high-level theoretical arguments that I've seen, because they know the king doesn't want them to do this, to have their own mint. But they do make a practical argument that, we need our economy to function, and we have to have a kind of currency. And so, yeah, I haven't seen that particular issue it doesn't really show up in the petitions. It doesn't really show up in those kind of high-level constitutional debates. But it's certainly an important issue, and I think for the colonists, it's simply practical. The other economic issue that's a really big deal is the control of Maine. Right, and of course Maine is Abenaki territory, but everybody's trying to get a piece of the resources, and so I think that's the economic issue probably that shows up more often in the constitutional debates.